there is a tone of betrayal. So there is a fear that the establishment, that the Russian elite, that Putin himself is going to give Donald Trump concessions and will go and sell out all the great achievements that the Russian army have allegedly achieved. So there is a fear amongst the extremist pro-war commentators in Russia that this is going not well, and that the Russian establishment is weak and the Russian economy isn't strong, and therefore they're fearing that Donald Trump is going to bulldoze through some sort of strong deal for the West and against Russia.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Vlad Mykhnenko. Originally from Ukraine, Vlad is a professor of sustainable urban development at the University of Oxford, who specialises in geographical political economy. Vlad, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Hello, James. Hello to everyone.
I mean, there is so much to discuss at the moment when it comes to the war in Ukraine. Obviously, we're now a week into the second Trump presidency. Are you optimistic that Donald Trump has what it takes to stand up to Vladimir Putin?
That's a very good question. Am I optimistic? I'm cautiously more optimistic than I was before. I think that's fair to say. And I'm optimistic more than before because it looks like the new administration and people surrounding President Trump are trying to give him an understanding that this particular war is not going to be ended in one day, and probably not in 100 days. And therefore, I think there is a change in the perspective. There is a change of rhetoric, and that is quite hopeful, I think, because obviously there is no particular strength in rushing to concessions immediately, and there is no particular reason to do that. I think that's not a good negotiating tactic.
It is part of your cautious optimism because of some of the rhetoric we've seen from Trump in the last 7 days. I mean, first of all, he gave a kind of, when he was signing those executive orders, he was almost freewheeling with the press, and they asked him about Russia and Ukraine, and he said, look, Putin is destroying Russia with this war. And he identified the weakness of the Russian economy. Those comments, by all accounts, did not go down well in the Kremlin. Then you had Trump coming out saying, if Putin doesn't end the war, I'll impose new taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on Russia. Now, we know with Trump, sometimes he talks a big talk. Whether he'll walk the walk is another matter. But do those comments give you that cautious optimism?
I think absolutely. And also, they've given me cautious optimism because watching the Russian propaganda media, it's obvious that they were quite spooked. And there is an enormous amount of sort of hate speech against Donald Trump. And therefore, it looks like the rhetoric, the tone in particular, which kind of moved from being respectful to a bit more threatening. I think the tone has changed in Washington, D.C., and that has upset the plans, I think, that the Kremlin have had for the beginning of this administration.
Yeah, that's really interesting. As someone who follows the Russian propaganda media, what are they saying at the moment? I mean, the Kremlin came out after these Trump comments about Putin needs to end the war or will impose new taxes and tariffs and sanctions. And they said, look, we're ready for negotiations. But of course, what they're prepared to negotiate over is a very different matter. So what is Russian propaganda media saying currently?
So you have quite a split, it looks to me. So on the far sort of fascist right, amongst the 5-10% of people who are in this war, who are either on the front line or supporting the Russian war effort in the kind of Z blogosphere, as we call it, there is a tone of betrayal. So there is a fear that the establishment, that the Russian elite, that Putin himself is going to give Donald Trump concessions and will go and sell out all the great achievements that the Russian army have allegedly achieved. So there is a fear amongst the extremist pro-war commentators in Russia that this is going not well, and that the Russian establishment is weak and the Russian economy isn't strong, and therefore they're fearing that Donald Trump is going to bulldoze through some sort of strong deal for the West and against Russia. That's sort of one big camp, but growing camp. And even in the main Russian federal channel television station, there are already some dissenting voices, or they have allowed at least one dissenting voice out of 5 talking heads who would say, well, it looks like we are weak. It looks like we don't have a lot of cards to play. There is no Trump cards left against Trump. And so there are, even in official television, that watched by millions of old age people in particular. There is already sort of a talk about, well, we've got to sort of make a compromise of some kind. We can't really believe anymore we're going to end up the war on the Polish border. We can't really believe we're going to conquer Poland and reach English Channel. So let's kind of, let's be realistic. This is a new era. So I think that is a change. Whether that's people kind of speaking out suddenly their minds, or they're giving some sort of leeway now. Okay, five of you are going to be strong anti-West, but one of you cannot start talking about concessions, which are probably more plausible. I think that already shows that there is some sort of wobbling. The Kremlin is wobbling.
I mean, it's really fascinating how Putin sort of positions himself going into potential peace talks, because he is still publicly saying, his spokespeople are saying, that they want to achieve their maximalist objectives. So the capitulation of Ukraine completely, the removal of the Zelensky government, the installing of some kind of pro-Moscow puppet government, and holding on to all the territory they've captured, really back to 2014. And that's not realistic, that they're going to achieve all of that. Now, is that just a negotiating tactic, or do you think in his mind's eye, Putin is still determined to achieve that?
Difficult to say what they really think. Obviously, we need to trust what they say, because we know when somebody is trying to tell you something horrible, probably they mean it. And so I presume this is a maximalist objective, that we will take over all the territories that we decided that is ours, even those territories that never been occupied or conquered by the Russian army, and Ukraine, been destroyed as a political entity with a puppet regime, kind of turning Ukraine into Belarus, right? Which is in the news this week as well. That is unrealistic, and I'm sure inside the Kremlin, most people, apart maybe for some really extremist lunatics, understand that is unachievable. And therefore, I think it is just a trick to play some sort of hard card. But I don't think they believe themselves that is plausible.
Mm. What about this issue of in whose interest is it to have negotiations sooner than later? Because you could almost, in my view, spin the argument both ways, Vlad. And I wonder if you have a view. If you're Ukraine, you could say, look, there are problems on the front line in the east. Russia continues to make incremental advances. There's an issue with manpower. Zelensky hasn't moved again with lowering the conscription age. It is in Ukraine's interest to have a negotiated settlement sooner. You could make that argument. Equally, you could say that actually it's in Putin's interest, because of the long-term pressures on the Russian economy and his own manpower and materiel issues, for him to have a negotiation sooner. Do you have a view on in whose interest having a quicker set of negotiations is in?
The expert opinion is split. It looks like there is one group of Russian exiled economists who have written recently a big report on the state of the Russian economy, saying that in putting themselves in kind of the official statistics view, is that if you look at the official statistics, presumably the news that Putin is given by his aides, they can go on for a year or two, right, without much destruction. On the other hand, we have more professional economists, people who are on the ground, who are investors, who are actually involved in the Russian economy, in Russia itself, saying, well, the situation is pretty bad. The inflation is horrible. People are stealing butter from shops, which is not entirely a big, it's not caviar really. The inflation is high. The national sovereign wealth fund that Russian had, those billions of money, is spent to 5 billion left in terms of cash reserves. So there is not much actually to tap in. The interest rate is extremely high. The Russian military-industrial complex is crying that they are all unprofitable and loss-making, which is probably true. And so we also see the decline in industrial production, particularly military industrial production, right? So they're running out of steam, running out of people, running out of equipment. And therefore, we have these two different, completely diametrically opposing views. One says, well, it's really, it's not collapsing, but it is close to collapse in terms of the economy in the medium term. And another group saying, well, actually, they still have reserves, they still have quite a lot of savings account that they can rob from the people and send. So there is some cash in the economy still that can be taken if necessary for the war effort. But that, of course, would be quite an extreme measure. If you start stealing people's money in savings accounts, that obviously is not going to be a very popular decision. So it looks like there is no consensus opinion here. And of course, some of us are leaning towards one scenario, some of us are leaning towards another scenario. We have, some of us who predicted the Russian economy would collapse earlier are now very cautious, right? And presumably the Russian exile economists are exactly that group that promised or at least believed the collapse will be in 6 months, and now we're in year 3 almost of the war. So we need to kind of keep in mind these possibilities, and yet I still believe the noise coming from the Russian industrialists complaining about interest rates, complaining about high credit, complaining about manpower shortages, is much more realistic, and therefore surely, and also the data that we have on the Russian military losses in terms of the equipment. We've recently seen quite a lot of open science intelligence data is that effectively over the war, the Russians were losing about 70% of lost equipment was Soviet made, 30% was newly built. Now they're approaching 50-50 scenario, which means that they're running out of the Russian Soviet stock, right? All those 30,000 tanks that Donald Trump mentioned Russia had, they run out of most of them. And so, which is good news for all of us. But also that means that they will have to rely more and more on the new production, and they're only capable of producing hundreds, not tens of thousands of items. And that means that, realistically speaking, it's not just the economy that is in dire straits, but also the actual military equipment shortages are growing. We've seen those videos of Russian attacks on buggies, on scooters, on electric vehicles, on even the Lada cars, just civilian cars driving it as fast as possible through minefields. That is not out of so fun, right? It's not a fun ride. So that means that they've run out of proper military equipment. And I think that's sort of another sign that probably it is an early deal will be favorable to Putin much more than it will be favorable to his opponents.
And crucially, Donald Trump has clocked the weakness of the Russian economy. He was speaking about this last week when he was saying, look, Putin's war effort is destroying the Russian economy. He needs to end the war to aid his economy. And so much of what the Kremlin is trying to achieve with its kind of external propaganda efforts is to frame this narrative that somehow Russia is going into negotiations from a position of strength. But if Trump is there going, well, hang on, you're not that strong because your economy is on the verge of crumbling, that spells bad news for Putin.
Absolutely, and rather bizarrely, I would say, President Trump's sort of showmanship and also his demands of various foreign territories like Greenland or Panama Canal are also playing, also spooking the Kremlin as well. If he's playing like this to his allies and he's treating his allies in this way, what imagine he would be treating people who are not his allies. So I think that they're quite spooky that if he's willing to shout 25% tariffs one day on any random country, and visa restrictions and everything for a particular reason, and for a really tiny kind of misdemeanor, what would be able he to threaten with if we're talking about something serious. So I think they're quite spooked as well on that front, which is not, I'm not condoning or supporting that type of diplomacy, but this is what effect it has at the moment.
How do you view, Vlad, the relationship between Trump and Putin? I mean, it is very complicated. Historically, it's been written up that somehow Trump was a lapdog of Putin. I think that's pretty accurate, to be honest. But clearly, he has been maybe the preferred candidate of the Kremlin in comparison to Biden and Harris. Mark Galeotti had an interesting piece in the Sunday Times over the weekend in which he explored this. And he also pointed out the fact that, there is meant to be this face-to-face meeting soon at some point between Putin and Trump. And that actually is very risky for Putin because if he inflames Trump in any way, it could spectacularly backfire. How do you read their relationship at the moment?
I think Trump 2.0 is different from Trump 1.0. He's now, first of all, in his final term. He definitely knows that whatever he says, he's a very Teflon, he's a super Teflon character. Whatever he says is not going to be held against him because everybody, the expectations are very low. And therefore, I think whatever compromising materials, whatever kind of dodgy financial or any other kind of shenanigans that Donald Trump might have had with Russians or with Russian billionaires or with the Russian state earlier, maybe in the 1990s or the early 2000s, who knows? I would say Donald Trump might think this is nothing now. Whatever you can throw at me, I will say it's a lie, fake news, and people will forget about it in 24-hour cycle. So I think the whatever strengths that the Russian potentially, let's speculate, they had some sort of compromising material on him. I think that's now absolutely worthless, and I think he understands that. Whereas the weaknesses of the Russian economy and the military machine are quite obvious to everyone to see. And hence, I think the balance of power has shifted in this relationship quite dramatically. Not to mention that, Vladimir Putin is also much older and much weaker physically, mentally. The regime is much weaker. The best people, one of the best people left. Whoever survives already thinking about how to survive after Putin, right? So I think the balance of power has shifted quite dramatically in favor of Donald Trump in that relationship.
Do you think also we're starting to see the signs, according to reports at least, that Putin is losing some of his kind of grasp on the situation? Mark Galeotti also talks about how in briefings now, Putin doesn't listen to the same extent that he used to. He doesn't absorb the information that's being presented to him by his advisors in the way he once did. Now, whether that's complacency, whether that is age, whether that is just the signs of someone who has been in power for too long and doesn't think he needs to listen. Do you think we're seeing those signs of Putin almost losing his touch?
I think that was evident early on in the war. I think in 2022, maybe half first 6 months of the war, somewhere there, the Russian military correspondents and various bloggers went to the Kremlin, and there was a big meet. It was televised, or at least some part of it was televised, and all these people who were, rooting for the war and trying to help Russia to occupy Ukraine faster came in with a long list of demands and complaints, and they thought that the Tsar is going to listen. It's just the boyars, right? Is that the entourage, the milieu are not willing to tell him the truth, and now he will listen to the truth and he will do something about it with the generals and the admirals. And I think you could see their faces being absolutely astonished when actually it was Putin to tell him how the war is going and how well people are advancing and how great equipment is there and how brilliant the Russian tactical medicine is working, that 90% of them actually survive any attack. And you can see the faces of these military bloggers were effectively changing to disbelief, that they thought he doesn't know and they're going to tell him the truth and things will change for the better, whereas actually he didn't want to listen and he just told him another story, another fairy tale. And that has, I think that was already early on. You could see that he doesn't really want to know the real story. He wants to tell people a good story.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below.
What about the relationship, the personal relationship between Trump and Zelensky? Because it's a complicated relationship again, like the one with Putin. And I think that the circumstances around Trump's first impeachment in 2019 and the role that Ukraine played in that probably doesn't help Trump in terms of giving him a sympathetic view to Zelensky. Not that Zelensky was in any way to blame, but I think in Trump's mind, he associates him with that. And yet, since Trump's election victory, Zelensky, I think very cleverly, has been on a real charm offensive with the Americans. How would you sum up their relationship currently?
I totally agree with your assessment. Obviously, Trump holds a grudge against Zelensky because of the first impeachment, also because of the Joe Biden son's shenanigans in Ukraine that were covered up by the then establishment for obvious reasons. You don't want to upset the reigning reigning president to complain about his son's behavior. So obviously there is no good chemistry in that relationship. That is, and I was evident even in the recent Fox News interview when Trump said, "Oh, Zelensky is not an angel. He shouldn't have done this. He shouldn't have done that." So he has a little bit of a lecture to give to the Ukrainian president of how he should have behaved back in 22 or even earlier, and that you could feel there is still a resentment there. But the reality of power seems to be also overwhelming, and I presume Donald Trump. There are many other foreign leaders he dislikes, but there are many other foreign leaders he would have to deal with, and I think that is sort of a relationship that will be pragmatic in the end. And yes, I agree that President of Ukraine Zelensky, using his artistic ability, is playing as good a card as anybody could have done in that situation.
Well, he's a very, very naturally gifted politician, and he was in Davos last week at the World Economic Forum, and it was interesting. I thought that he basically called out a lot of the European leaders who were there. And, it's a fair point that Europe probably should and could be doing more to support Ukraine, both through its own defense budget and through military aid to Ukraine. But what's interesting is that ties in with the criticism that Donald Trump has towards Europe. And so the message was almost as much designed for Trump to go, look, I agree with you, Europe needs to be doing more, as it was for Ukraine's European allies.
Of course, and also Zelensky promised or offered, not promised and offered to take over some of the burden of the NATO membership away from the US by stationing Ukrainian troops across Europe instead of the American troops, which is a spectacular offer. But it is obviously a saving money offer, and also saving the military, the boots on the ground kind of offer, which if President Trump really believes they're going to shake up the NATO, I think that's one of the issues that they will be discussing for the allies that are capable of fighting rather than just spending 0%, 0.3% on defense.
Do you think that's a viable offer, Vlad? I mean, obviously not at the moment. Ukrainian troops are needed elsewhere, but long term, is that a viable offer?
I think long term there is a lot that Western militaries and armies can learn from this war, and of course there is only one army that's fighting there on the Western side and has the experience and know-how and really been innovative in developing very cheap solutions to big problems, and also been capable of holding up territory with man shortage, as you already described. So I think there is a lot of tactical, if not strategic, thinking that could have influenced the NATO military command, and there are lots of things to learn from the Ukrainian success in the war effort. I think so. The talking about the kind of balance of positives and negatives, I think the Ukrainian military in the NATO will be a massive plus for the Western alliance, rather than another way around.
Just on the manpower shortage, I sort of referenced it earlier. Do you think it is time for Zelensky to look again at lowering the conscription age?
It's difficult to maintain the line that the Ukrainian government has been running with, is that there is not enough of equipment. That is why we cannot mobilize more people, because we cannot equip them with, given that we have obvious reports that there is a man shortage on the front line itself, and there are a balance, or at least equity in some places in terms of artillery and in terms of kamikaze drones, is the imbalance on the actual manpower, and hence something drastic needs to be done, whether it is related to the age of conscription and mobilization, whether it's related to the effectiveness of mobilization effort. It is beyond doubt something needs to be done. If I were President Zelensky, I would play that card in negotiations with the Western allies, saying if you really think this is a solution, let's go for that. But then we also need, obviously, equipment for another 300,000 people, and that's therefore you would need to improve and increase military support, because otherwise, obviously, you can't just have unarmed people running around the fields. The issue has been also with training, right? The UK has been training 10, 12,000 a quarter. If you need 300,000, that's a lot of training to do across Europe. So there are logistical and sophisticated, significant material and technical problems here. But I think something needs to be done publicly, and that could be this could be probably a good time to start negotiating with Western allies in terms of the manpower shortages, the lowering the age of mobilization versus improved and increased support.
Trump's team obviously have not met their original targets to resolve the conflict in 24 hours, but they're now talking about this 100 days to try and do it in the first 100 days of the Trump term. Is that realistic?
I don't think it's realistic. It's a targets and deadline. Having deadlines is good to some extent, and yet at the same time, then Putin will understand. They've got 100 days. I'm going to hold up. I'm going to put a very hard stance on negotiations. Whatever they do, I'm going not to give them anything, an inch, and after that, we'll see what happens. I think it is unrealistic to. I don't know what kind of threat the U.S. administration can actually use against President Putin now. Obviously, there could be a level of threat that is impossible to resist. But if we are looking at a normal sort of type of negotiations, at a normal level of conversation, then I think 100 days is definitely not enough, given that the fact that you would need to have some kind of ceasefire force, some kind of military international observation force to hold to that ceasefire line, and obviously in 100 days nobody can conjure up 50 or 100,000 foreign soldiers to bring into Ukraine. That's obviously impossible.
And looking ahead to what a possible deal may look like and what the terms would be, do you fear it is inevitable, Vlad, that it will involve the ceding of some Ukrainian sovereign territory? Even if Ukraine doesn't officially recognize it as being Russian, there will be a kind of freezing of parts of the front lines that would allow what is currently under Russian control to stay that way in exchange for some kind of security guarantee for Ukraine. That's not the ideal. I know there'll be many people watching who think, well, look, we shouldn't give up any sovereign Ukrainian territory. But realistically, do you think that's where we're heading?
I would say that the best scenario would be to try to hold on to this fighting for another 12 months and see what the internal dynamics in Russia will prove to be. The recent opinion polls that continue to regularly ask people questions: how long can they suffer this war? The latest one still says that 63% Ukrainians respondents say for as long as it takes. 6% say for 1 more year. So if you combine those two figures, you will have almost 70%, at least definitely 2/3 that are capable of surviving this for as long as it takes, or at least another 12 months. You have a third who are really suffering and say, I cannot take it any longer, or maybe 6 months max. But it just have the majority of people who are fairly resilient to this war. In terms of the opinion polls and in terms of negotiations, the number of people who believe that in order to achieve peace and preserve independence as soon as possible, Ukraine can give up some of its territories. The number of people agreeing to that statement increased to 32%. And yet I need to say that 30% has been stable from May 2024. So almost for the last 6 to 9 months, the number of people who say that this is plausible has not increased. So it kind of stabilized after the Kursk offensive and stabilized now after the Trump rhetorical offensive. People who are saying that we shouldn't be giving up any territory has actually slightly increased to 58%. So as much as we all know lots of people suffering, as much as we all know our friends, relatives, and acquaintances saying this is really horrible and it's we can't really take it anymore. This constant barrages of missile attack, drone attacks, especially Shahid drones, and that really gets people literally awake at night for many months. Still, you can see maybe 2/3, definitely more than half of people are capable of holding up for now. And I think I would say that probably is a better way of strategizing for the next 12 months. Using the military equipment and support that was given in the end of the Biden administration, try to get something out of Trump administration. You might continue negotiating, but I don't think that will go far very fast. And so continue to increase obviously the number of mobilized soldiers, use the equipment, and continue to hold the line for as long as you can. I think 12 months is a good number. And after that 12 months, I think the situation will be radically different from a kind of 50-50 truce conditions to something much more in Ukrainian and Western favor. Because I think, I keep reminding people, the German army was not far away from Paris in 1918. Right, it wasn't the French troops that were marching to Berlin, and yet the First World War finished the way it finished. So I think this war has a much more First World War ending scenario for me in kind of thinking than any other type of war.
It's a really good point, Vlad. This has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks, James, and all good luck.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.